inside this because I can't, and I'm due to inside. How are we going to do it? Simon volunteered to video one set, and I'll video the other one. Obviously, we don't have the time to feed back to all of the groups, so we'll have these videos made available, like I said. But my dilemma is, do we group assessment groups together, or who worked on the same scenario, or assessment and feedback? Assessment and feedback.
Yeah, that's right.
So who goes for assessment and feedback? Yes? Okay, I guess we have to go with this one. I found the other one more interesting, but let's go for that one. Great. We have two groups who are going to stay in here. You stay in here, and you're going outside. Right. Now, what's going to happen is I would like you to, because it's not just presenting your solutions or suggestions, but it's also providing feedback. Do you listen, Charles? It's also providing feedback to the other group. Okay? So make notes, capture some of the things that people say. You can agree, disagree, think that it's a good or not so good strategy or effective strategy. But I would like that to be turned into a dialogue, and you have 15 minutes.
The whole
Okay?
thing.
The whole thing, yes. Let's do it now. Simon, do you want to stay here or outside?
I'll stay in here, I don't mind.
Where do you want?
I don't mind, I'll stay in here.
What do you prefer?
Fine, I'll stay here.
You stay here.
I'll stay here, yeah.
Right. Yes. Let's do it outside. Yes, you present to each other and you give feedback to each other, and it's all captured on the camera.
Or not.
Or not, depending on how the operator
Yeah. She seemed quite clear about that, but she doesn't know what I'm like with a camera.
Not developed it. Oh dear. Fail. I'm going to bring something else. Nice one, Ben.
I am assuming that we all have the same trigger.
Well,
No, we don't. That's what
we had feedback when you had the
we
assessment.
decided, and then we decided that people do that
What was your trigger?
group presented. Ours was assessment presented to another group.
So about the guide, like,
Yeah,
you are
yeah.
the century, but we've
Same?
got feedback and you
So
Yeah.
we need to know the problem.
Yeah. We've established we've got the same trigger. That's good. Well, where assessment shall we start and then?
Yeah, I'll carry it on. Wonderful.
Right, I can get it over.
I'm sorry, I know it might be rude, but I will have to go at 1:30.
We're only doing it for 15
I-
minutes,
oh,
Rosie,
okay, that's
so-
fine. So if you just simply disappear. Yeah, so I'm not being
We'll
rude.
keep it brief.
I'll keep on.
Right, so you saw this guy who was doing 150 essays and he'd done the same essay for 10 years. So our first thing was we decided to just highlight the issues, which you can all appreciate what the issues were. The fact that he was doing one essay, so it was like one big summative, horrific essay that a lot of the students were failing. And firstly, our issue was that it was just one assessment at the end of the module, and therefore the students had it was what we called a high stakes. So this is a high stakes form of assessment where if they failed this, then tough. They had no opportunity to improve, no feedback beforehand, no means of formatting assessment. So that was an issue. And we thought that also the format of having an essay, is that appropriate in this day and age? Is it really addressing the needs of the student? All students don't learn the same, we all know that, so it's using an essay and just an essay without any degree of flexibility, the most appropriate format. And also, in terms of the flexibility as well, we were basically saying that I know sometimes you get offered a choice of different subjects that you can write about, but it sounded like this was just one topic, that he'd chosen without letting the students actually engage and get involved in that selection process and what interested them. The other thing was the fact that it was 10 years old, which we highlighted. This guy obviously is not trying to critically analyse whether this is, you know, anything to do with this assessment, whether it's working. He's doing the same thing over and over again without trying to improve it. We didn't know anything about the content of that, but what concerned us was that it might not be relevant content anymore in today's society. It might not even be particularly relevant. And in terms of the content as well, does it actually relay back to the objectives, the learning objectives and the learning criteria? Is it relevant? Is it actually testing, by doing this essay, something that refers back to the learning objectives and outcomes? And this also, is it actually engaging the student? So if it's all content, then it's likely not to engage the student, which may impact why they're doing so poorly. Other issue, feedback. How, you know, is he actually asking the students how useful they're finding this? Are they having the opportunity other than at the end of the module to say what the problem is? At the end of the module it's too late. So is there no opportunity for them to, or him to collect information from them before that? And also our concern was the mark scheme. So are the students aware of the mark scheme? Do they know what they're going to be assessed on? And if not, then why not? You know, they should know what they're being assessed on so they can tailor the essay towards that. Also, is the mark scheme appropriate? If it's the same mark scheme that's 10 years old, you know, things change, you know, mark schemes might nowadays incorporate the use of technology or whatever, so that was one thing we were concerned with. But we then decided that our learning objectives would be, and I will pass the book forward.
Yeah, so the issues we discussed, arising from them, we've got two main learning objectives. So basically, we should ask whether, one, summative assessment is appropriate in order to assess the student's knowledge, and secondly, are there any alternatives and which ones are appropriate? And we've just sort of highlighted a few there, and basically, from the research we did, we found that summative assessment should be complemented with formative assessment in order to address the weaknesses of the former. And using that knowledge, Craig and Carlo have constructed a graph which he'll be doing now.
Yeah, it's hopefully pretty self-explanatory. Module launch, we implemented a summative assessment halfway through, which we put a made-up figure of 40% on that. That could vary, with the summative assessment at the end of the module being higher, so there's a little bit of a ramp up and a build-up. Formative assessment points distributed through the module to both reflect on maybe in this case the module launch, so some reflection there, and also a discussion on about what you're going to do over the next few weeks and what your next sort of things you're thinking about, and then that will inform the next formative assessment point, where again that sort of action will go on of reflection and what is about to happen, so the students are fully informed throughout the process.
And I think one of the things that came out of the trigger was that this lecturer thought that students weren't engaging. Yes. So we thought, well, you know, you need to think about how you think this module is going to progress. So we looked at different ways of engaging the students in the module around assessment. So we thought about perhaps having negotiated formative assessments with the students that they themselves might negotiate between themselves, or they might negotiate with the tutor what that assessment would be. And that wouldn't necessarily just mean the content, it could actually mean how they were going to be marked on that. And we thought that would increase the engagement and get more feedback for the tutor as well. We felt that we would want to see a module to have some elements of experiential learning throughout it, and again that might be linked to assessment. We talked a lot about how the portfolio for us in the PGCAP is making us engage with the module, and we're having to do assessments all the way through. And Chrissy talked about this patchwork idea where we can put anything in terms, so in a sense that's not negotiated, that's actually student directed in terms of what they decide they will put into their formative assessment along the way. And then finally, we thought that the summative assessment needed to have elements of not just subject-specific content, which appeared to be what was happening in this particular module. It needed to have generic skills as well, so it was a mixture of the two.
Brilliant.
So over to you guys.
Okay, so we basically looked at what his problems were when we looked at it. This time was obviously an issue which I'm sure we're all really familiar with. He talked about how much he did, he talked about focusing on them doing things wrong, and the worry that the students weren't even bothering to collect the feedback. So we started by trying to think about those structures, and in the end we find that back to a simple question of, is summative feedback necessary at all? Okay, and essentially I'll just deal with a tiny little bit that I did on the PSS. So I went and looked at the professional standards framework, and yes, it is necessary, or feedback is certainly necessary, because we are required by Policy 3 as activities to do that, and there are also 2 knowledge-based assessments which relate strongly to teaching and learning. Now the PSF doesn't specify summative feedback actually, or not in the reduced form that I've seen it in, so I suppose arguably we don't need it. However, thinking further on that, I've got a big thing there saying get a job. Employers, other stakeholders in the education system find summative assessment really handy, and summative feedback, even if the summative feedback is as simply as A minus, A plus, B, whatever, first 2, 1, however we're going to classify those things, there are people who need and want those, and the students themselves need and want it, even if it is, you know, summative assessment at its most simple and gruesome. I then drew a picture of cows, I don't know, stuff to do some, you know, the cow suit guy looks a little weird. So, okay, that's me done.
Okay, then we looked at the definition of summative feedback. What is it in relation to what literature is out there? So basically, summative feedback is, in a nutshell, is a summary of a student's abilities at the time which is given. Okay, it is given at the end of the course or module. It judges a student's overall performance. And it is useful for, as Ben mentioned, for those external to the learning process, like employers, industry. This is essential for them. Then we looked at what is good practice and bad practice. So
yeah, I was trying to investigate that where institutions and people were using summative feedback, whether there was any guidelines about what worked well and what didn't work so well. And apparently, if you're going to do summative feedback, then it should be linked to the learning outcomes. It should all be aligned. And here's a nice one. Summative feedback, I guess with essays, your bog standard summative feedback, it should be simply more than editing and correcting. Because I think some people's feedback is like grammar. I know mine is. And it should be clear, and there should be some tips for improvement. Good practice as well regarding summative feedback. It's quite interesting, and maybe we can talk about this after, but it said that e-feedback is now good practice, and using banks of pre-formatted comments are meant to save you time, and I think that this shift towards doing your summative marking electronically may not be a great experience for the educator. I mean, I don't know what the students are thinking about it. Regarding good practice going forward, there may be a way, as you've picked up, to sort of move it more towards peer feedback and e-portfolios and make it almost more formative. That's something that we picked up on as well. With bad practice and the problems of summative feedback, it's often one way, so there's no dialogue, no feedback, no loop, was this word, wasn't it? We get the feedback loop that we found. It's, often the marks are given on forms that are pro formas, one size fits all, given at the end of the course, as you picked up as well, and this is the reason a lot of studies say why the students don't bother to collect it, because they've already gone through the module and all the developing that's going to take place has happened. It's too late to have the feedback, and that's why they don't engage. So on to Rosie to finish up.
Well, I looked at the benefits of summative feedback. And we've already come across a couple of them, the idea of external bodies being interested in those. Interestingly, I did come across a paper where it said that sometimes summative feedback is deemed to be fairer, but more stressful for students. And I think the circumstance was where the feedback was done anonymously, so you don't know who the student is. So, you know, it's in quite a kind of formal exam situation, I guess. It also said, interestingly, that summative feedback can be motivational, particularly when it's done early on. And I think that started us to kind of think about, actually, is that actually summative feedback, or is that formative feedback? And that there's a lot of crossover. I think we've already discovered that between the two groups. There's a lot of fluidity between the two areas at certain points. And interestingly, I actually haven't shared this with the group, but I did have an example where, again, I'm not sure whether it's summative or formative feedback, but I had a student who said, I don't understand why in my studio practice I get A's, and in my essay I'm getting D's. What am I doing wrong? And I went through his form with him, and lo and behold, he followed the advice, and his next essay he got 62. So that's quite a big leap. But whether that's actually the summative feedback that's doing that, or whether that's formative, I think we felt there was a big crossover. Again, that the summative was the kind of very end point, which I think Ben mentioned.
I think me and Ben, we even discussed that if you think about life-wide and lifelong learning, is there ever anything such as, unless somebody gives you a grade on your deathbed, is there ever anything that really truly is summative?
Yeah, so some people will say that's exactly what happens.
Well, that's
that was going through my mind.
very philosophical, isn't it?
I think the sort of point that we got to that I right, I don't know that everybody agreed with me, that in a sense summative feedback only almost exists as the grade.
Yeah, that's true.
Everything else really is formative feedback.
Pure.
What to do. If you've got the next module is not the very last thing that you ever do, then you can use it and move on. And if it is the last thing that you ever do at university, maybe it will be useful for a master's degree or in a job or something like that. So we were a bit uncomfortable with the distinction. It's almost like you can talk about the two things, but summative feedback it's very, very narrow compared to formative feedback.
We said it might be like a continuum where assessments are either very summative or they move much more towards formative.
But I suppose it depends on what the feedback is that we give you summatively.
But that's the...
Yeah, because if you're only, I don't know if I'm getting this wrong, but if you're only giving feedback on the content of that particular module or assignment, then it is an end point, isn't it?
How is it an end point? Do you think that you never use any of that knowledge and any of that learning and none of the things that you did apply later? I find it hard to see anything bar that you did this well, the grade, as being something that couldn't in some sense be construed as formative.
So I see, I have understood what you're saying, because I look at the feedback I give in a summative situation as being something on whether they got the content right and the process by which they wrote the content. And because our modules are discrete, they don't actually link in with each other sometimes.
Right.
So then they have a habit of then almost putting that book up on the shelf and forget about it.
Right.
Which is what I think I was trying to interpret
You're
yours.
right.
Yeah. Whereas if I'm giving them feedback on the generic skills of writing and expression and that sort of thing, then they will I see that as being formative because they'll take that back into another module.
So it depends on whether you tell, not only telling them that they're getting feedback, but perhaps what kind of feedback they're getting.
Exactly.
And which portion of it is which kind of...
Whether you choose to finish your learning at the exam or whether, whether you go on and
Still
read
gonna
things
take
in the spare time. I don't always read things that relate to my specific discipline, either as a student or as a member of staff. So,
I'm thinking, because now they've spoke, I'm thinking that's wrongly worded there, isn't it? Asses. No, it's kind of wrongly worded because that's feedback really, isn't it? It's not an assessment.
Yeah, it's formative feedback.
You're not getting a mark there, so it is really feedback.
Has anybody picked up? This is what I was
thinking.
It's two sides. It's two sides. If you notice what we did earlier, we actually put down all the information we got about feedback and all the feedback we got about assessment. The first thing they said is, Chrissy, they're the same. And you had a different trigger, so did we, but we
all come up. Yeah.
Two sides of the same
They're
coin, isn't it?
related, aren't they?
It's
It's the
not
same,
it.
it's kind of the same.
No, the assessment is the way. An essay, for example, or a test. Feedback is what you.
But it's like it's two sides of the same coin, isn't it? It can't exist without.
Once
You know.
you move assessment here, like they've done, then what's the point of it? It's not just something that goes out, is it? You see what I mean? Like they can move, like definitely you've got formative assessment as well as summative assessment, so part of it goes to your grade. So if you take my definition of summative assessment as only being grades, they've got part of their summative assessment, but they also get formative assessment. I totally put
It's in relation.
in here, like little feedback loops. When you were talking about your up and down, I was thinking that sounded so much like what we were talking about, whereby
The
you let
loop,
students
the loop.
tell you
Yeah.
what they thought about the feedback and what they'd like more of and what they'd like less of and so
And
on.
in-
So that would be a spiral rather than
Yeah.
a backwards and forwards type
Yeah.
relationship.
Yeah, it's
It
always-
was-
And I forgot to say in the good practice regarding the feedback loop, and they do try and do it in our school, but everyone just laughs at it because it's not implemented very well. But the idea is that when you hand in the work, you can also hand in, if you want to, something about how you felt about producing the work and difficulties you had and what you felt you learned. And so you're also telling your teacher how you got on with it before they even mark it.
It's not reflective
Good.
components, one of those. Only very small, but
Yeah.
Great indicator, yeah. It's not your fault necessarily,
Right.
just
Yeah.
able to do it. Any questions?
I was going to say,
What?
I'd like to bring up the topic of e-feedback because I actually think that's going to make us more. I don't think the students are going to appreciate it because because the way that it's been sold to us is that we have statements that we literally drop into the assignment.
It doesn't work like that though, because you end up writing notes because you actually care and want to
Well,
give them
that
good
would be-
feedback.
you do
That's
that
why it's
normally.
here.
If you want some training, you can literally do exactly the same as you do when you're marking it by hand. So there are these like set things where you can drag a thing up and it's a spelling, it's just spelling, grammar, but then you can type whatever you want all over the document. You can, what I have is if they've got to answer a specific question, I will prepare some model answers. But then I will use those, but the most of the time I'm just dropping off like, you've not read the question, that's a really good answer, but it doesn't address you. You can type all over it and do what you want. My issue with that is they can't let you know what they think about your feedback. Like, it's very one-sided, so...
I just put in, come and see me.
Yeah. And
But,
also,
but a lot of them don't.
But you offered.
and there's
I find that, sorry,
no, Ben.
well, you're
Well, I think there is also an issue about the fact that when they print it out, those comments don't remain there; they actually go to the bottom.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, well,
That was a
I've
bit
not
bad.
kind of witnessed it, but when I had my training, we asked what happens if a student wants to print this out. I mean, they may not want to, but you know.
So they have to do it on screen.
It brings up a number, so say if you put a comment on a particular paragraph, it'll
Yeah.
say number 1, and then at the end of the document it'll say number 1. So they can follow it back. But the way I get around that is there's a thing where rather than dropping a text bubble where it appears as a little bubble, you can just write on the script. So when they print it out, it's written on the script.
On the script.
So you can just type everything out. It means a little bit more typing for you. And it's obviously it's not as convenient being able to drag a bit. I'm assuming that the majority of us aren't going to want to give generic feedback.
I'm not spending hours.
That's the
So
It takes me an hour to mark a script that's less than 2,000 words because I
Just
care
write
a
all
lot
of
about
it.
it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm finding. What I was going to say is that because basically what you've done is you change your strategy from doing it in the way that's time efficient, all it does is actually mean that it takes me longer, definitely takes me longer to mark scripts using that. Like checking references is an absolute nightmare. With a piece of paper, tick, 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 you know, I can just sit backwards and forwards. There's an obvious physical need to do it.
You know, the people who designed that couldn't
Never mind
be
it, never.
teachers themselves, they couldn't be teachers.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, it doesn't, maybe they have a much faster network than we do, because the network
Possibly.
here is absolutely appalling.
But maybe they thought that everyone would just want
I
to...
haven't done any feedback at all. We're about to start it next year, but I have reservations from my perspective in terms of my eyesight.
Yes,
You know, I have an astigmatism. I get my eyes get very tired very quickly when I'm looking at a computer. So am I going to have that amount of concentration to be able to do that? Whereas if I sit with an assignment in front of me like you, I'll flip back and turn.
Yeah, and you can take it anywhere in the way you
Yeah.
can't on a laptop. I mean, when I'm taking the train home, on the way in it's possible to work. On the way home, I mean, Cheryl's like, prescriptive, but I mean, it's absolutely rammed. I'm often standing, and if I do get to sit down, it's really cramped. I can't get out of my laptop. My eyesight is nowhere near good enough to do it on a smartphone or something like that, should I want to, which I don't. But a script, I could sit there and mark.
Yeah.
So it also hinges on my ability to manage my time as well, and I definitely found it took longer. Definitely. I mean, I don't know whether I'm getting better feedback.
People have said it has taken longer.
Everyone that I've spoken to.
It's just...
Yeah.
And in a sense, what we're all talking about feedback being really, really important to us here, aren't we? We see that as being something that's important, and this is challenging the way we perceive feedback and the way we want to.
But it takes so much more time than your workload for it.
Yeah.
It's,
But I
you know, the
can't-
amount of time that
I can't inconscion it. I can't give crap feedback because I wasn't given it and it made such a difference to me, so I want to pay that forward. I can't do a bad job.
It's all well and good
Can't
until
do
you've
it.
got, you know, you've got essays to write, seminars to deliver, book chapters to write, papers to write, and they all have the same deadlines, and then suddenly it's like, if I'm only given that much time to do it, there comes a point when I only, like, literally only have that much time. I'm already using it pretty much every weekend and every evening to work, and I'm absolutely behind on everything. You know, we are not workloaded for the amount of work that it takes to do it. I'm workloaded 3 hours per hour of lecture, and I'm teaching outside of my subject area, and I have to write notes to Hong Kong, which for my last lecture took me 3 hours of alone to do that. You know, it's a totally unrealistic estimation of our time, and I find that the marking, if you care and if you give good feedback, it takes time. We're told to do it, but we're not given the means to do it.
They want it doing well. They need more time and
Or training.
Or training.
Have you been
Well, I am trained.
My feedback is exactly the same as what I do because I have because most of the teaching I do it on behalf of the module leaders, so they basically still design the module. I just waltzed in and they're like, right, you teach these practicals, you teach these lectures, and some of them are saying, right, I want it handed in at the office, so I'm staggering with a big thing of scripts. And then other people, it's like, right, the reports are online, and once you understand, and no one showed me how to do it, and once I had my training, I was like, oh, this is really easy, and it is, there's no difference.
The mechanics of it is simple.
I'll tell you what, it takes less time on the e-submission for me, just because I have a lot of plagiarisers on my course who cut and paste, and at least that
You can just put one
because
word
I
on
used to
it.
spend a lot of time reading an introduction and then typing it into Google and going, yeah, that's too much people.
Yeah, no, the text
So,
matching.
you know, and I don't find, I still, the amount of feedback that I do is the same, but I can understand like the issues with your eyes and stuff. Because I were like, at 12 last night, I was like, I've got 2 more reports to do, and my eyes felt like they were bleeding, and I was like, I've got 2 more to
It's a
do,
health and
2
safety
more
issue,
to do,
but we
2 more
shouldn't be
to do.
looking at monitor for the amount of time consistently we do. We are instructed not to. You've got to
But you
take
can still print them out, like, I know one of the
Yeah,
one of
but then you've got-
one of the old lectures I know, it
Do your
prints out
feedback.
every single assignment,
Which
and then
doubles the time.
and then that's it, and it doesn't.
Has anybody looked at the type of assessment that lends itself to feedback and the type of assessment
I wonder,
that
actually.
doesn't? Because I'm guessing that possibly yours, with it being very science-based,
Yeah.
was probably more right and wrong in the assessment. Whereas I'm thinking of Ben's as a psychology. You know, some of the, you've got higher cognitive skills in terms of the...
I'd say it's the reference checking. It just takes ages to check every reference on something. It's like, if you've got a long reference list and you need to check every time it's in the text that's in the reference list and everything that's in the reference list in the text, it's trivial to do with paper and it's horrendous to do about printing it out. But we're not supposed to be printing out. We've got limited print budgets and all the rest of it. It's like, and if I print something out and read it on the train and write down all my feedback, then I'm doubling.
And then you're not going to do the feedback.
Then I have to do the feedback in addition.
I mean, for us, we don't the text analysis stuff. A lot of our linguistics assignments are assignment based, so they have to perform the same steps to like work out a problem. So actually, they all end up with really high similarity scores. No one's colluded or plagiarised.
No,
It's just that we're expecting them to converge on an answer.
But that's why they don't say
Yeah.
if it's above this, then it's clearly
It's not
Yeah,
very
you don't
A
need
lot of
to
the
yeah,
time, it's
sure.
just the fact that
They're done.
you know, if they've got to
Yeah,
listen to
yeah,
the questions, they might have written those questions out, or they've all used the same reference.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
you just need to learn how to look at it.
So have we all achieved our learning outcomes for this particular exercise?
Well, let's recap on Participate and collaborate in a small group around assessment feedback. We've all done that. Identify and critically analyse issues linked to the given PBL trigger. We've all done that. Present findings to another PBL group. And, we need to provide each other with some feedback.
I think we've done it.
We did it. I think we've done
Ongoing dialogue.
saying yes.
Dialogue group, yeah.
Yeah, I think we've. What do you reckon, boys? Have we met the objectives?